A prediction for 2022. Get ready for price controls. I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's compare 1971 to today. And for those of you who aren't familiar, 1971 is the last time we had price controls right here in the United States. To refresh your memory, editor, let's go right to the internet.
Inflation robs every American, every one of you. The 20 million who are retired and living on fixed incomes, they are particularly hard hit. Homemakers find it harder than ever to balance the family budget. And 80 million American wage earners have been on a treadmill. For example, in the 4 war years between 1965 and 1969, your wage increases were completely eaten up by price increases. Your paychecks were higher, but you were no better off. We have made progress against the rise in the cost of living. From the high point of 6% a year in 1969, the rise in consumer prices has been cut to 4% in the first half of 1971. But just as is the case in our fight against unemployment, we can and we must do better than that. The time has come for decisive action, action that will break the vicious circle of spiraling prices and costs. I am today ordering a freeze on all prices and wages throughout the United States for a period of 90 days.
Tell me you couldn't hear Joe Biden saying those exact same words today. So back in 1971, Nixon saw that prices were going up a lot faster than wages, something we have going on today in 2020 and 2022. And almost every politician knows there's almost a 0% chance they get reelected if they don't come out and do something. If the constituents that they're trying to pander to don't see them as bold and aggressive leaders. In fact, we can go to the government's website right now. And what does it say right there in the first or second line? That the administration is going to take decisive action. Well, what did Nixon say back in 1971? Editor, help me out with that one.
The time has come for decisive action, decisive action, decisive action.
So we can see not only was there a similarity between 1971 and what's happening today with prices, but there was obviously a similarity with rhetoric. And there was definitely a similarity with the politicians in that they all have one thing in common and one priority only. That is, they want to be reelected regardless of the cost or the government distortions to the economy at large, which is exactly what price controls will do. More on that in a moment. But let's go back to this chart of CPI, core CPI. So that's the consumer price increases as measured by the government when you exclude food and energy. Going back to 1965 all the way to today's date, on the left we go from a negative 2.5%, that would be deflation, up to 15% inflation. At the end of the 1960s, as Nixon said, we were right around 6%, right about here, and then we came down to 4%. I don't know if you caught that in the video. But when Nixon implemented price controls in 1971, inflation was right around 4%. What is it today? Core CPI right around 5%, headline CPI at 6.8%. Far higher than it was in 1971 when Nixon implemented price controls. Step number 2. Positive real rates of interest. This is really the only cure for consumer price inflation. Let me explain what I mean. First of all, I want to point out, going back to 1971, what happened to interest rates back then? They stayed relatively low compared to inflation. Why? Because if Nixon, or the Fed chair, who I believe was Arthur Burns at the time, would have raised rates to a level that would have smashed the inflation instead of price controls, this would have been political suicide. So Nixon took the path of least resistance, like every single politician usually does, including what I think Joe Biden and Kamala Harris would choose to do today. They take the path of least resistance, which at the end of this step, I think I'm going to prove is price controls before they implement the extreme positive real rates that would actually be effective in combating inflation long term. But this is the chart I was referencing. We go back to maybe around 1965. I started with 1970 because I wanted to match it up specifically with the chart above where we were talking about core CPI. So we got 1970 all the way to 2020. You'll notice I had to consolidate or compress this decade a little bit more than the rest because I completely forgot to put 1995 on this chart. So it still looks pretty much the same, but we got a hashtag fail right there on my part. So we'll just pretend that 1995 never exists. We go from 90 to 2000 here. We'll go from 90 to 2000 right there. The main thing I need you to take away from this chart is really from 1970 to call it 1980 or 81, and then 2020. Back to this chart. Interest rates were around 4 or 5% when Nixon implemented price controls in 1971. But then in the mid-1970s, inflation really went up. We see this spike to call it 14, maybe 15%. What did interest rates do? They went up to 12, 12.5. Now you'll notice that even if interest rates were slightly positive, they're probably still negative, especially real inflation, because this was the CPI as measured by the government. And although it's not as bad as it is today, as far as how dramatically it understates inflation, it was still most likely understating it back during the 1970s. So this 12.5 Fed funds rate would have been a negative real rate. In other words, the nominal rate might have been 12.5%, but if inflation is running at 15 or 20%, that's higher than the rate of interest. Therefore, the interest rate, when you adjust for inflation, is negative. And then the interest rates came crashing down. They thought they beat inflation back after 1976, 77, we'll say, but then it came roaring back to the point where it got to maybe 15, 16% again, a little higher than it was in 1975. So then Volcker had to come in and bring Fed funds up to 19 or 20%. You'll notice the difference. And that's interest rates back in 1975, right around the rate of inflation, maybe a little bit lower, but now he took them significantly positive. In other words, the Fed funds rate was much higher than the rate of consumer inflation. And this is what finally broke the back of the price increases that decimated the 1970s. So the question then becomes, what are interest rates today? Well, Fed funds is a range between 0% and 25 basis points. That's 0.25%. Well, headline CPI is almost 7%, and core CPI is almost 5%. So that means that right now, best case scenario, when you just look at core CPI, we have negative 5% real interest rates. So where would Jerome Powell have to take Fed funds rate today to break the back of consumer price inflation? They'd have to be at least 7%, not 70 basis points, 7%. So we'd have to go from 0 up 700 basis points to have a realistic chance of breaking the back of inflation if we see this inflation persist like it did in the 1970s. Now I need each and every one of you watching this video to go through a quick thought experiment. What would happen to the stock market and the housing market if Jerome Powell took interest rates to 7%? I think you know as well as I do that this would absolutely collapse the stock market, the housing market, and therefore the overall economy. This goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, that effective rate hikes would be political suicide. So if we are to assume that the current day politicians, their only objective, number one priority, is to get reelected, they've got a big problem. Because if they don't raise interest rates, then inflation runs hot, they don't get reelected. But if they do raise interest rates to an effective level, they decimate the stock market, housing market, the economy, and therefore their chances of getting a second term in office. So what's the path of least resistance for Joe Biden right now? It's the exact same thing as it was in 1971 for Nixon. And that is price controls. Step number 3, how will price controls affect you? Every single person watching this video right now. There are no certainties, there are only probabilities. But because of what we discussed in step 1 and 2, I think the probabilities are high. We see price controls in the United States in 2022, maybe 2023, if the consumer price index remains high or goes even higher. So how will this impact your daily life? First of all, it'll exacerbate the current supply shortages that we are experiencing in 2021. And this is something that's unique. In 1971, going into the price controls, they didn't have supply shortages. Today, because of the government's response to the cerveza sickness, we have massive supply shortages. So expect these shortages to get even worse if they implement price controls in the future. Also, you'll see the quality of goods and services deteriorate dramatically. Why? Actually, pretty simple. To illustrate my point, I've got my good buddy, entrepreneurial Eddie. And Eddie is not carrying a basketball on his back. He's actually shrugging an atlas. That is right. And like all good entrepreneurs, they're producers, they're job creators, and they are carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. But Eddie has a widget factory, we'll call it Factory XYZ, and his cost to produce each widget has gone up to $2 because of the price inflation. But Joe Biden or Kamala Harris come in and say, oh no, Eddie, you cannot increase your prices anymore. In fact, you can only charge $1 for your widget. But Eddie says, wait a minute, my cost is $2. So I'm not going to create any more widgets because I lose money on each one that I create. Or what he's going to do, he's going to say, how can I create a widget at a lower cost, say 95 cents? And the only way he can achieve that objective is if he makes a really crappy widget, at least a lot worse than the one he was making before. So we have the supply shortages get a lot worse, and the quality of the goods and services you buy daily goes down. It plummets dramatically. And to explain this concept even further, let's cut to a clip of my favorite economist, Thomas Sowell.
There have been many other areas in which there have been price controls. They have a standard, really stereotypical pattern. One is that you reduce the supply of whatever is being controlled. Not surprising, since people do less when they're paid less. The other is that you reduce the quality of what's being controlled, because higher quality is costlier than lower quality. And when you force the prices down, people then reduce the quality of what they're producing. One of the classic examples is housing. Wherever rent control has been put in, there is a shortage of apartments. In many places, there's a provision in the law that says this is only a temporary measure until the housing shortage is over. And sometimes they define that in terms of some percentage of vacancy and so on. And what they don't understand is that as long as that law is on the books, there will always be a shortage, and there will never be a time to take the law off the books. In Paris, they put a law like this on the books as an emergency measure during World War I. It was still in force when World War II broke out. In Sweden, they put one in the early days of World War II. Decades later, it was still there. Finally, for some reason, it occurred to someone to take off the price controls. Instantly, there was a housing surplus. The housing projects put up by the Swedish government suddenly began to have high vacancy rates, and in fact had to be bailed out because they couldn't fill them. I thought about rent control a few years ago when I visited West Berlin. It was still a difference in those days. And I could see this marvelous new modern city. And I came back and visited some of my relatives in the Bronx. And as I drove into the Bronx and I saw all these hulks of abandoned and boarded up buildings, I thought, suppose someone from Mars had come down here and you said to him, which of these two cities was bombed during World War II? He would pick the Bronx, because Berlin had recovered from the bombing, but the Bronx had not recovered from rent control.
So Berlin could survive the bombing, but the Bronx couldn't survive rent controls. Oh, but wait, there is more. Unfortunately, supply shortages and lower quality of goods and services isn't the only thing we can expect from price controls. We should also expect an inflation explosion when price controls are finally lifted. Let's go back to the chart that we had of core CPI 1965 to today's date. I want to point out 1973, more specifically January 1973. This is a key date. Why? It's when price controls were lifted. So prior to price controls being lifted, the CPI was right around, let's say, 3%. As soon as they lifted the price controls, what happened to prices? They exploded higher, straight up to over 12.5%. We should expect to see the exact same thing here if the government implements price controls, and if they finally lift those price controls because of the damage, the economic destruction they have done to the economy at large. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.